Okay, so Roosevelt, he kind of pretends that he's in agreement with the Americans, although there's a profound disagreement on how to defeat Hitler. Roosevelt doesn't really stress the point that he just sees things very differently. He wants to create a ring around Germany. In fact, one of the volumes of his memoir was called "Closing the Ring," whereas the Americans want a direct thrust across the across the Channel into France and then into northern Germany. And Churchill kind of downplays the disagreements. He doesn't want to go against the Americans. And he's smart enough to realize that every month the Americans are getting stronger and the British are getting weaker. It's very painful for him, but that's the reality. So let's go back to Marshall. Marshall in 42 starts developing a game plan. And the first part is called Bolero. And you don't have to remember that. You won't be tested on it. But it has to be called something, right? And Bolero is kind of a cool name. And the idea of Bolero, it makes sense, really. It's that the U.S. has to build up its forces in Great Britain, right? It has to send men and material over there. The U.S. also has to send material to the other Allied forces, the British, of course, the Canadians, the French, the Poles were fighting. It really was a coalition army. And it's going to take a while to get all this stuff over there, to get all these men over there. And as I said, I'll say it again though, the German U-boats in 1942 really kind of have the upper hand in terms of sending, in terms of sinking merchant ships. This was a big issue. It was really important because that was the only way to get men and material from the United States to Great Britain was by the ocean. And until the U-boat problem was solved, which doesn't happen until 43, it slowed down the process. So anyway, so that's part one. Makes sense, right? It's kind of intuitive. Now the second part was a long shot invasion over the Channel in 1942, which was called Sledgehammer. Okay. This was a pipe dream on the part of Marshall, but what he's trying to do, I mean, he would have loved to cross the Channel in 42 if he could have, but I think he's also just trying to push this idea of the cross-channel invasion. Churchill is able to put the brakes on Sledgehammer, which would have been the 1942 invasion, which would have been a complete and utter catastrophe and might have lengthened the war for years. Thank goodness it didn't happen. Now, his plan B, Marshall's plan B, was what he called Roundup, which was the cross-channel invasion of Great Britain in 1943. So this is his plan, and as we know, he has to delay until 1944. It just turns out that Marshall, even though he was a great person, he just overestimated what it would take to gather the resources to cross from Great Britain, the short distance across the English Channel into France, and then the buildup into France. So, but the big point here, without getting kind of lost in the weeds here, is that England becomes the base, the supply base. The men are being trained of the coalition army. The material is being gathered, and Marshall is constantly pushing this idea of a cross-channel invasion. Now, another important point that is very, very significant, and I really want to underline it, it's the Russians, okay? I haven't talked too much about it, but after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Great Britain and the Soviet Union are part of an alliance. The kind of the classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Stalin didn't trust Churchill, he didn't trust Roosevelt, but they're fighting Hitler. And, you know, Churchill and Roosevelt didn't trust Stalin. So, but Stalin is, remember 42, right? When, you know, this is Stalingrad, you know, beginning in August of 42, he's saying, we need a second front, we need a second front, we need a second front. So every time U.S. and British diplomats and military leaders meet with Soviet diplomats and military leaders, the first thing out of the mouths of the Soviets is, when are you going to start a second front? We need break. We need a help. We need help. We're facing the German army alone, and you have to come in. You have to create a second front. Otherwise, we're going to lose the war. So Churchill is aware of this, but I think Marshall was really acutely aware of this, the importance of creating a second front to kind of give the Soviet Union a break. So what he does is that Roosevelt kind of stays in the background, which is kind of his style. He didn't want to get into a fight he didn't want to intervene in this fight between Marshall and Churchill. And what happens is ultimately Churchill wins out in the sense of slowing down the cross-channel invasion. And he persuades the Americans that it's just not time yet. It's just not time to do a cross-channel invasion. But so the Americans are looking for a target of opportunity, and it's under this context that the invasion of North Africa happens in the fall of 1942. The Allies had to invade some place, okay, where there were Germans. And it was too soon to invade the continent of Europe. The Germans, as we know from watching Casablanca, had gone into North Africa. So the decision was made that in the fall of 1942, Operation Torch would be launched, and that the Allied forces would recapture North Africa from the Nazis. And so North Africa, in some ways, the decision to invade North Africa comes from the idea that the Allies have to attack someplace, right? Stalin is demanding some kind of action on the part of the Allies. And think of the context. The fall of 1942 is also the time when Stalingrad is happening. And actually Hitler pulls some troops from the attack on Stalingrad to North Africa, which shows his terrible strategic thinking, which again is one of the key points I want you to take from this course. Stalingrad was such a knife-edge thing. He should have just kept his eye on the ball of Stalingrad. So the invasion of North Africa played, I wouldn't say a super significant role in the German defeat of Stalingrad, but it played, to a certain extent, a significant role, or a role. I wouldn't say it was significant. The other thing about the North Africa campaign was that it allowed the United States military to get some hands-on experience in terms of how to stage an invasion from the sea, how to fight the German enemy. Remember, the army was mostly made up of draftees. The U.S. wartime army, I think, was like the 20th largest army in the world or something when World War II started. So what happens, North Africa becomes, North Africa is invaded because the U.S. and Great Britain has to invade somewhere, and North Africa makes the most inviting target. But it serves a number of purposes. It takes a little bit of the heat off of Stalin, not a lot, but a little bit of the heat off of Stalin. It allows American troops and high command to kind of figure out how they're going to fight this war. So in some ways, it serves as a very, very important training session. And when all is said and done, when the Germans surrender in North Africa, they are ultimately defeated after about a 6-month campaign. 250,000 German troops do surrender, which is not an insignificant amount. It's actually more than were captured at Stalingrad, and we know what happened to those poor folks. Interesting side note, many, not all, but many of those German troops that were captured in North Africa ended up in Texas, because there were prisoner of war camps in Texas, all throughout Texas, East Texas and West Texas. So a portion of these German soldiers that surrendered ended up in Texas, ended up as prisoners of war in the United States. And of course, they were the lucky ones, because they didn't have to fight anymore. Most of them lived to survive the war.